I have been silent for centuries, not by choice, but by nature. I was crafted from olive wood, shaped by the calloused hands of a nameless man long gone, sanded smooth, not for comfort but for reverence. I was placed in a corner of the temple, far from the altar, closer to the shadows where the weary sometimes sat, not the priests, nor the righteous, but the ones who slipped in with heavy hearts and empty hands. They came and went. I remained. I listened, though I had no ears. I remembered, though I had no mind. I waited, though I had no concept of time. Time moved differently for me. There were no years, only visits. No calendars, only footsteps. Seasons changed in the draft that wandered through the temple's stone. I marked them not by color, but by sound. In spring, sandals slapped hurriedly, minds lightened by the promise of new crops. In summer, feet dragged with weariness, the heat pressing down like the taxes they could not pay. Autumn brought quieter steps, thoughtful ones, eyes turned inward. Winter was slowest, with few brave enough to come through the biting wind. But even then, there were always a few. I remember the first time I sensed a prayer rise that was not spoken. It came from a boy, no older than 10. He sat without moving, staring at the altar as if willing it to move. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles paled. He said nothing, not a word, but the air around him thickened, and I could feel it, the ache that swelled in his chest. His father had died. I learned that later, not from words, but from the way the boy returned the next day, and the next, always sitting, always silent. Each time, the same gaze, the same stillness. He never looked at me, but I remembered him. There were others. A woman who came every week on the same day, tracing her fingers along my edge as if reading a story only she could see. An old man who sang hymns with a voice cracked by time. A young girl who cried only when alone, always after lighting a candle. I watched them all, or rather, I was with them. I could not see, but I was never blind to their presence. I began to wonder if this was my purposino, just to be sat upon, but to be present, to witness, to carry what they could not say aloud. And still, the one they all seemed to long for had not come. I heard his name in their pleasant times shouted, more often whispered, the promised one, the Messiah, the deliverer, their words tangled with hope and disbelief. Will he come? Has he forgotten us? Are we still his people? The questions echoed not in speech, but in posture, in sighs. In that long look some gave the door before turning away. They carried these doubts into me, like a sponge pressed into water, and I bore them, silently, faithfully. There were moments when I almost believed he would never come, that this waiting, this longing, was the true shape of faith, not the fulfillment, but the ache itself. Yet even in that, there was something holy, something raw and honest, a reaching without end. And I, though made of wood, began to share in that reaching, not with arms or eyes, but with being. I became a vessel of waiting, a relic of the not yet. And though I could not speak, I ached, too. Then came the night of the broken lamp. A storm had come in from the west, wild and loud, rattling the temple doors. No one came that evening. I sat alone, cold, in near darkness. The oil was gone, the flame died, and in that silence, I felt something new, not grief, not hope, but a stillness so deep it trembled, as if all of creation was holding its breath. I had no lungs, but I too held mine, waiting, listening, wondering if, perhaps, the one who was spoken of in shadows might finally come, not in thunder or fire, but in a way so quiet, only those who had learned to wait would notice. I remained still. I remained ready. They came to me with trembling hands and eyes that pleaded without shame. Some stumbled through the heavy entrance, barely able to keep upright under the weight of sorrow or sin. Others slipped in quietly, as if afraid their very presence might desecrate the sacred air. But I welcomed them all, not because I could choose, but because I was there, unmoving, unchanging, available. And over time, that quiet availability became its own kind of ministry. I began to notice the patterns not of who they were, but of how they arrived. Some came dragging feet, others clutching scrolls, a few with songs on their lips, but most came empty. And still they sat. One man came every week at dawn. He wore the robe of a teacher, but his voice was always small. He sat hunched, his head bowed low, murmuring prayers not from scrolls but from wounds. "Why do you hide your face from me?" he would ask, always in the same spot, his fingers tracing an invisible circle on my edge. I wanted to answer. I wanted to ease his pain, to tell him he was not alone, but I could only be there, and perhaps that was enough. For he returned, again and again, never once missing his appointment with silence. There was a woman who came with her son, though she never called him that aloud. He was perhaps 16, eyes distant, mouth often clenched in silence. He would not speak to anyone, not even her, and yet she brought him every week. She sat him beside me, placed his hand on mine, and then stepped back, watching. She never prayed aloud, but her entire body was prayer. The way she watched him, the way she waited, I began to wonder if faith wasn't loud or confident, but patient, endlessly patient. Her son once looked up, just once. For a moment, his hand flexed, and I swear I felt warmth where his palm met my wood. Then it was gone. Then there were the forgotten ones, the beggars, the lepers, the ones not allowed inside during the day. They came at night, when the priests were gone, slipping in through the servant's door. They didn't ask for healing, they knew better, but they sat with me. They leaned against me. Sometimes they simply curled up nearby, asleep or in pain, and I became a cradle for their final hours. One man died at my feet. No one noticed until morning, but I knew. I had felt his weight grow still, his breath stop, and I held him quietly until someone found his body. Through all this, I began to understand the difference between waiting and watching. Waiting was passive, watching meant presence, attentiveness, a kind of sacred listening. And so I watched them, not with eyes but with being. I noticed the shaking hands, the twitch of a lip, the way some knelt while others stood. I noticed how some touched me as if I were holy, while others avoided contact altogether, afraid their sins might stain even a bench of wood. I noticed how rarely joy entered the temple. Lament was the language here, and yet, beneath all that pain, there was a thread of expectation. They still believed, even in the cracks, even in the silence. They still hoped, against hope, that the one they longed for would appear. And perhaps that was what moved me most, not their words, but their return. They came back, over and over. Despite unanswered prayers, despite the silence from the heavens, they returned. And in their returning, something holy began to take shape. A communion not of wine and bread, but of breath and burden. One night, I remember a Childa girl, maybe 7, who climbed into my lap and sang. Her song was not loud, nor beautiful, but it was true. She sang of a God who sees, who hears, who comes close. And as she sang, I felt something stirred deep within my grain, something old and familiar, like a promise waking from a long sleep. She finished, slipped off, and skipped away, never knowing what she had awakened. I remained still, but I was not unchanged. That night, I waited differently. There were moments when I thought I could feel their questions settle into my frame. Not just the desperate ones, like, will he survive the winter? Or, how will I feed them tomorrow? But the quieter, more dangerous ones, does God see me? Or, was I ever truly loved? These did not come with screams or weeping, but with silence, long, drawn out, aching silence. I learned to recognize them in the way someone would sit down and exhale without words, as if trying not to disturb the air around them, as if they feared even their breath might be too loud in the presence of the unseen. And in all of it, I was never asked for answers. Perhaps that is what made my presence bearable to them. I did not correct, I did not preach, I did not demand faith or purity or understanding. I simply was. In that way, I became a place where broken faith could rest, where belief too tired to stand could lean for a while. They sat with me because I did not turn away, and perhaps that was what they needed most, someone or something that would not recoil at their doubts. Over time, I felt those who came to me were not seeking miracles, not really. They sought presence. They sought a place to be seen, even if by a piece of wood. And though I could not see, Somehow I did. I became the space between their breath and the divine, the place where longing hovered just above the floor and dared to rise like incense, even if only for a moment. Then there was the widow who never wept. She came every month on the day her husband had died. She brought no offerings, lit no candles, spoke no words. She only sat, completely still, entirely silent. And yet her silence screamed of memory, of love, of loss, of decades shared now gone. I felt her absence more deeply than any wail. When she died, I knew before they told anyone. Her absence echoed louder than her presence ever had. They came to me with questions they couldn't speak, with pain they couldn't name, and I held it all, not with arms or heart, but with a patience that only centuries can teach. And though I was never made for this purpose, it became mine. I became more than a place to sit. I became a place to lay down what they could carry nowhere else. And in doing so, I too began to long not just for their healing, but for the one they awaited. The one who could do what I never could. The one whose touch, I knew without reason, would be different. I waited with them. I watched with them. And one day, I would know him by the way he sat. They never heard an answer, not once. Not in the wind through the temple's archways, not in the measured tones of the Levites' chants, not even in the solemn silence of the Holy of Holies. Their voices rose, year after year, and I heard them all pleas for healing, cries of hunger, whispered promises of reform, if only heaven would move. But nothing moved. The sky remained shut, and yet they kept praying. They came to the temple with hopes frayed thin by time, with questions too brittle to be spoken aloud. They asked for sons, for rain, for mercy. They brought lambs and doves, but also fatigue and desperation. I received it all. I bore it not in my strength, but in my stillness. I remember one man who returned every year on the anniversary of his son's death. He would kneel beside me and recite the same psalm, his voice hoarse by the end, his tears silent but steady. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. I came to know those words as if they were carved into my frame. I imagined them etched into the wood grain, one syllable at a time, worn deeper by repetition than by any blade. And yet, the silence endured. No voice responded from the heavens. No light pierced the temple darkness. The silence was not empty. That was the paradox I came to understand. It was full brimming with longing, saturated with generations of waiting. But to them, it felt like absence, like abandonment. They spoke of the prophets, of the stories passed down, of burning bushes and parted seas, of manna from heaven and pillars of fire. But those days were long gone. Now, there was only silence, and it bruised their belief. I could feel the dissonance inside them, the war between memory and the moment, between the glory they had heard of and the quiet they lived in. Some began to adapt their prayers not in content, but in posture. Instead of asking, they began to surrender. Instead of demanding, they wept. They did not bring sacrifices as much as they brought themselves, broken and bare. Their prayers became less about receiving and more about releasing. And I, the ever-still witness, bore those prayers like breath upon my surface. I began to believe that perhaps this too was Holith, the prayer that never sought an answer, only understanding. The prayer that said, "Here I am," even if no one answered back. Others, though, could not bear the silence. They came once, maybe twice, and then never again. I remembered them too. A young man who sat down full of fire, who quoted the Torah with trembling lips, who looked toward the altar with eyes blazing. He asked why injustice thrived, why the righteous suffered. He sat for hours that day, unmoving, waiting, but no sign came. When he left, I felt the weight of his absence like a door closing. He never returned. His fire, unmet, had burned out, and still, others kept coming. There were days when I myself, though made of wood, longed to cry out. I wanted to shout at the heavens for them. I wanted to ask why they had been left in such a long night, why the stories of miracles felt like distant echoes rather than living truth. But I could not speak. I could only absorb, and in my stillness I learned that silence itself could be sacred, not as a denial, but as a preparation, that what felt like absence might actually be the pause before a word that could shatter the world. They never heard an answer, but they left something behind, each time a sigh, a whisper, a tear, a silence of their own. I gathered them all. I held them in the grain of my being. I became heavy not with sorrow, but with stories. Stories half told, prayers half formed, hopes half lit. And I waited, carrying them like seeds buried deep in soil, aching for rain. I began to wonder what it would take to break the silence. Not just for them, but for the world. Would it come as thunder, with angels splitting clouds and fire pouring from the heavens? Or would it come in the opposite way, so quiet that only those who had become fluent in silence could hear it? I had seen generations rise and fall, some hardened by the quiet, others hollowed out by it. But a few, just a few, were deepened by it. They became wells, holding more than they knew. Their faith wasn't a spark or a blaze, it was an ember, glowing low, but enduring. There was a rabbi who never prayed aloud but always sat with eyes closed, mouth moving. He brought scrolls sometimes, but more often brought only his breath. I felt something in him that I could not name, a stillness that was not resignation, but reverence. He once stayed through the night, unmoving. In the early morning, before even the birds stirred, he opened his eyes, touched my armrest, and whispered, "Even the silence is yours." Then he left. I never saw him again, but those words never left me. I held them like a lamp in my grain. And so I held the silence, not as emptiness, but as offering. I began to believe that the temple itself was learning to breathe with the rhythm of their prayers, that even stone could soften under the weight of expectation, that something was shifting. That silence was not the end of the story. That maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning. And I waited not with frustration, but with reverence, because, perhaps, one day, the silence would break not with sound, but with presence. I waited for the day when a single footstep might echo louder than 1,000 voices, when a touch would speak louder than any prophet, when the silence, so long held, would exhale in a breath that changed everything. I did not know when it would come. I only knew I was ready, and I prayed, in my own way, without words, without voice, that when it came, I would recognize him not by the sound he made, but by the silence he fulfilled. Then one evening, just as twilight settled into the corners of the temple, a boy came in alone. He could not have been more than 12. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate. He walked slowly, reverently, as if he knew the weight of the air he entered. He sat beside me, but Nirand looked not at the altar, but at the sky visible through the high window. He didn't pray, he didn't speak, he just breathed. And yet, something in that breath struck me. It was not a request. It was not a lament, it was a presence. That boy, he didn't stay long. He stood after a while, brushed the dust from his tunic, and walked out with the same deliberate stillness he had entered. But in the place where he had sat, I felt warmth, as if silence had been met with silence and found kinship, as if, for the first time in centuries, silence had answered silence. And from that moment on, I no longer feared the quiet. I welcomed it. I understood then that not every silence is hollow. Some silences are sacred. Some are waiting rooms for glory, and two would be ready. It was the night the oil ran dry. The lamps in the temple had flickered all day, and by evening, one by one, they surrendered to the creeping dark. No one had come to refill them. The priests were delayed, perhaps caught in some ritual or distracted by debate. Whatever the reason, the fire died, and with it, the last visible heartbeat of the sanctuary. I was there, as always, when it happened. I heard the final flutter of the wick as it gasped for breath and failed. Then there was stillness, not the stillness of peace, but of waiting, of a breath held too long. It was cold, not the kind of cold that creeps into the skin, but the kind that settles deeper, into the grain of your being. The stones exhaled their chill. The shadows pressed in heavier than usual. I had known night before, of course, but never without the lamps. Their golden light had always bathed the columns, warmed the air, drawn the eyes upward. Without them, the temple felt unfamiliar, hollowed. I had become used to holding people. That night, I held only absence. Hours passed. I could not measure them, but I felt them. The air thickened, the silence deepened. In the darkness, sounds became more meaningful. Every creak of timber, every sigh of wind Through the high arches, every distant rustle was magnified. I began to listen, truly listen, not just to the world around me, but to something deeper, to a silence that was not empty, but brimming. It was then I noticed something strange beneath the quiet, beneath the stillness. There was a rhythm, faint, like a drumbeat buried under earth. I could not tell if it came from outside or within. I listened harder. It was not sound. It was awareness. It was as if the darkness itself was waiting, aware of its own impermanence. That night, I remembered things I did not know I had known. I remembered Eden not as a place I had seen, but as a fragrance, as warmth, as the feeling of a morning that had never known fear. I remembered the Ark of Noah not as a vessel, but as a cry in the flood, a hope that rose with the water. I remembered Abraham's trembling hands, Isaac's breath, the firewood bound. I remembered the bush that burned but was not consumed, the rod turned serpent, the manna, the fire, the voice that thundered from Sinai. I remembered them all not as stories, but as echoes deep within my grain. And still, no one came. I began to feel a weight I could not name. Not sorrow, though it was close. Not fear, though it whispered at the edge. It was something heavier expectation, like the moment before dawn, when the darkness holds its breath, knowing light is near but not yet arrived. I did not sleep, for I do not sleep. But I entered something like a vigil, something like worship. I waited, not just for light, but for presence, for movement, for the fulfillment of the ache that had grown inside me since the first whisper of his name was spoken in the temple courts. I was not alone in the temple. Somewhere far across the stone, I heard the rustle of fabric, the faintest shift of air. Someone else was waiting, or watching. I could not see, but I sensed it. Another witness to the oil's surrender. Another being, animate or not, who knew this night was different. That comfort had fled and left behind an invitation, not to fear, but to attend, to pay attention to the absence, to sit in the hollowness and feel its shape. Perhaps that was the purpose of the empty night, to remind us what fullness feels like. And in the center of all this, I remembered the words I had never heard but somehow always known. Be still and know that I am God. It was not a command to cease motion, but to enter trust, to release striving, to surrender presence to the greater presence. And I, an object without breath, obeyed. I was still. And I knew, sometime deep into the night, the wind outside shifted. It was no longer the restless moaning of branches or the sharp whistle through stone corridors. It became something gentler, almost reverent. It passed through the temple like a breath, soft and full of memory. I felt it wrap around me, touch my surface as if it recognized me, as if it had passed this way before. There was no fire, no voice, no shaking of earth, only this breeze that smelled of distant deserts and olive groves. It lingered, then wandered on. Still, no one came, and yet, I was no longer afraid. The darkness no longer threatened. It prepared. The silence no longer accused. It invited. I felt something in the air, not loud, not bold, but unmistakable, a gathering, not of people, but of promise, as if the whole of creation had turned its face toward this temple and held its breath. I had felt longing before, had witnessed hunger in countless forms. But this was different. It was as though the walls themselves leaned forward, as if the stones were listening. A memory, not mine but placed within me, stirred, a whisper of prophecy. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. It echoed within, reverberated through my grain. I began to understand that the darkness was not a punishment, it was a prelude. And we, the ancient, tired, faithful Thingstone and wood and waiting Heartshad, had been entrusted with the night before the dawn. When the first priest returned in the morning, muttering apologies, fumbling with oil and flint, he did not see it. He did not see how the silence had shifted, how the air had thickened with promise. He saw only darkened lamps and dust on the altar. He hurried to restore what had gone out, unaware that something greater than flame had passed through. But I knew, I had felt it. The presence without form, the promise without word, the approach without step. I had felt the one who comes drawing near, not with spectacle, but with certainty. I did not speak. I did not glow. I did not shake. I simply remained, and in that remaining, I bore witness. The oil had run dry, the flame had died, and yet the night had not been lost. It had been found consecrated in its emptiness, sanctified by its silence, and too was part of it. That night marked something in me. Though I could not age, I changed. I had felt the absence, borne the silence, watched the oil run dry, and yet I had not despaired. I had kept vigil. I had held the space. That was my offering, not fire, not incense, but steadiness, faithfulness without sight. And I began to believe that perhaps, in the great story unfolding beyond even the prophet's vision, my stillness mattered. That to remain when the light failed was not weakness, but calling. That to stay present in the dark was not failure, but faith. And so I remember that night not as a moment of abandonment, but as a turning point. When the oil ran dry and the lamps gave up, something else was lit within me. A flame not of heat, but of certainty. That the one we longed for was nearer than we dared imagine. That he would come not when the lamps blazed, but when the last of them flickered out. That he would not wait for the temple to be perfect, but would walk into its shadows and call them holy. I remain, still, and I remember. He entered without words. No proclamation, no entourage, no trumpet of arrival, just footsteps quiet, measured, almost hesitant. I knew the cadence of priests and the shuffle of penitents, the eager rush of children and the labored tread of the sick. This was none of those. This was different. The stranger walked with the weight of someone who carried no burdens and yet carried everything, as if the air around him was tuned to another rhythm and the world slowed to keep pace. He did not look left or right. He moved as if he knew exactly where he was going, and when he reached me, he did not hesitate. He sat on Minot beside, not near, but fully upon my wooden frame, as if he had always belonged there. And in that simple act, something ancient stirred within me. He was not heavy, yet he bore gravity. He did not speak, yet silence obeyed him. I felt no strain under his weight, only recognition, as though the fibers of my being knew him, as though I had waited not for prophets or kings or seekers but for this quiet, nameless man. He did not pray aloud, he simply breathed, and his breath carried something I had never known, peace that did not beg to be noticed. It settled into the space like a long-lost friend returning home. Around him, the temple seemed to inhale, not the wind, not the air, but the very stones seemed to awaken, as if creation had been holding its breath and now, in his presence, dared to breathe again. I listened not to words, but to presence, and in that listening, I heard everything. I heard the groaning of generations. I heard the ache of unfulfilled prophecy. I heard the longing of the poor, the cry of the widow, the silent desperation of the leper. I heard joy buried deep beneath layers of sorrow, and hope wrapped in centuries of dust. And he carried it all, without gesture, without display, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He placed his hand on the armrest, just once, no flourish, no ritual. But in that touch, I felt what I can only describe as recognition, not the way one recognizes a face, but the way soil recognizes rain, as though the very purpose of my being had finally been fulfilled in that quiet moment of contact. And still, he said nothing. Time did not pass in his presence, it deepened. The light from the high windows did not shift, yet I felt the movement of ages within that single seated breath. I remembered every person who had ever come to me in need. Their stories gathered around him like shadows drawn to flame, and yet he did not burn. He simply was, as if existence itself found its true tone in him, as if silence had finally learned how to sing. There was something in his stillness that unsettled and healed, a quiet that disarmed the loudness of fear, a pause that held more meaning than sermons. He was not large, not radiant in the way of angels or kings, but he was undeniable, like gravity, like breath, like the first dawn after a long night. In his presence, I did not feel holy, I felt known, and that, I learned, was the holiest thing of all. A child wandered in at some point, perhaps drawn by the stillness, perhaps by something deeper. She stopped when she saw him. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She said nothing. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the stone, watching him. That was enough. He smiled not broadly, not performatively, but gently, as if acknowledging a truth too deep for words. She smiled back and leaned her head against the pillar. Eventually, she slept. He remained. I began to wonder, was this what the prophets had spoken of? The shoot from the stump of Jesse? The one who would not break the bruised reed or snuff the smoldering wick? He did not look like a warrior. He did not command legions, but he commanded silence, and silence obeyed. A priest entered. He paused upon seeing the stranger, brows furrowed. He approached with caution, as if trying to recall whether this man belonged to a known lineage. But when he came close, he stopped. His mouth opened for a greeting or a rebuke, but no sound came. He looked into the stranger's face and was met with something that stilled him. Not fear, not awe, recognition. The priest did not speak. He simply bowed and left. No command had been given. No authority had been asserted. And yet, the priest responded like one who had heard a voice. And Iwe, the worn and watching, began to know. The stranger was no stranger at all. He remained long after the light changed, after the hush of the temple gave way to the rustling of returning feet. And still, he did not speak. He did not rise. He simply remained, as if waiting not for something to begin, but for something to end, or to be fulfilled. Others entered, drawn by the unusual stillness. Some paused, unsure. Some knelt without knowing why. One woman wept quietly, though she did not know his name. They did not address him. He did not invite. Yet the space around him became sanctuary, and a simple bench became an altar by proximity. He did eventually rise, slowly, not with drama, but with dignity. He brushed the dust from his garment, ran his fingers once more across my arm, and turned toward the outer court. I felt lost the moment his presence lifted. Not because he had taken something, but because he had left something behind. Not a relic, not a sign, but a new weight of meaning. I was no longer what I had been. I was a place he had once sat, and that changed everything. I did not know his name. No one said it aloud, but the wind that followed him as he left whispered something into the columns and arches, a name not in syllables but in essence. And I, though mute and motionless, understood it in the grain of my being. They called him stranger, but I knew him as fulfillment, as word, as beginning. And I wait now not for someone, but for him to return. For once someone like that has come, the ache of absence is no longer empty. It is expectant, it is alive, and I am ready. I no longer wonder what holiness looks like. I have seen it. It wears dust on its feet. It sits in silence. It leaves quietly, but never truly departs. And though I have no eyes, I have seen. Though I have no voice, I have spoken. Though I cannot move, I have journeyed. Because he came. And now, I carry that moment in every breathless hour, until he comes again. He never walked with haste. That was the first thing I noticed. Most who passed through the temple moved with purpose, driven by ritual, burdened by custom, pulled by fear or pride. But he moved as if time belonged to him, as if the dust itself parted willingly beneath his feet, not out of command, but recognition. I was not close enough to feel his sandals this time. He did not sit on me, but I saw him, and I remembered. The dust knew him, that I am sure of. I had watched centuries of sandals, hooves, and sweeping robes disturb the ground, stir up the air. But none had moved like him. When he passed, the dust did not rise in rebellion. It danced. It lifted like incense, like praise, like a welcome too ancient for words, as though the earth itself remembered Eden and responded to the one who had once walked there in the cool of day. He passed through the courtyard slowly, not watching, yet seeing, not teaching, yet transforming. His steps wrote something into the stone truth that could not be washed away, even by time. People noticed, not at first. Some glanced, then turned away. Others stared longer, uncertain, but one by one, they paused. And in their pausing, something shifted. A hush moved through the crowd, like a breeze through wheat. No one spoke it, but everyone felt it. He was not like them, and yet he was fully among them. Children ran toward him without fear, without filter. They always knew. One child, barely old enough to walk, toddled through the dust and reached for his hand. He stopped, bent low, and lifted the child into his arms. The dust swirled around them, golden in the late afternoon light. It hung there, suspended, as if reluctant to fall, as if longing to stay near him. I remembered then what it was to be new, before age, before weight, before time had carved lines into my form. I remembered being shaped from tree and sun and soil. I remembered my own beginning, and somehow, in watching him, I felt reborn. He passed me, close enough to touch, but he did not. And yet, I felt no lack. His passing was presence enough. The dust he stirred lingered in the air around me, not heavy, but holy. It settled on my frame like anointing. I had never been touched with oil, never marked with blood, but in that moment, I felt consecrated, and he moved on. Not everyone welcomed him. There were those who stepped back, eyes narrowed, arms crossed. They did not speak, not then. But their silence was not like his quiet healed, theirs judged. I recognized them, not by name, but by posture. They had sat on me before, rigid, rehearsed, filled with certainty but empty of compassion. They had scorned tears, corrected children, measured piety and posture. And now, faced with this man who carried no title, no scroll, no credentials, they bristled. He disturbed their comfort. He breathed a deeper truth, but even they could not stop the dust from dancing. Even their disdain could not anchor the air. Something had changed. The temple itself felt different, not in structure, but in breath. Columns that had stood silent for generations now seemed to lean in. Shadows retreated, not from light, but from presence. The birds in the rafters did not flee, they sang. One note, then another, until song echoed where only routine had reigned. He paused on right near the treasury. A widow stood there, small, unseen by most. She dropped in 2 small coins. I had seen many give that day gold, silver, excess. But this was different. He watched her, not with pity, but with honor. She did not see him. She gave what she had and turned away. But he saw her, and somehow, in that seeing, she became known. I believe she felt it, even if she never turned her head. She walked away a little taller. The dust around her seemed lighter. He moved again, toward the outer court, toward the noise, toward the need, and I wanted to follow. I, rooted and still, a bench of wood and years, longed to move. Not to be closer, but to remain with him, to be where he was. I imagined what it might be to be carried by his call, to be lifted and repurposed, to become not just a resting place, but a throne, not for power, but for mercy. I remembered the prophecies then, not the loud ones, but the hidden, the servant who would not shout, the Redeemer who would come lowly, the King on a donkey. And I knew this was he. Even after he left the courtyard, the dust did not settle. It hovered, caught in shafts of light, carrying memory. People remained where they had paused, uncertain what had just passed through them. Children whispered to one another, wide-eyed. An old man leaned against the gatepost and wept, though no one had spoken to him. A merchant removed his sandals without knowing why. And I, though unchanged in place, felt utterly new in purpose. The priests resumed their duties. The coins clinked. The sacrifices bled. The routine returned, but not for me, not for the dust. We had seen him. We had borne witness. And though he spoke no words, he had written truth into every grain of the temple. I carry that dust still, not as grime or memory, but as witness. It lingers in the corners of my grain, in the places where sunlight settles and silence sings. Sometimes, when no one is watching, I feel it stir, as if awaiting his return, as if remembering the moment the earth itself rejoiced. He was not loud, he was not grand, he did not perform, but the dust knew, and so did I. He was gone, but nothing was the same. Not the light, not the echoes, not even the silence. The temple breathed differently now, as if every stone, every bench, every grain of dust awaited something more. Not another ritual, not another sacrifice, but him. I have known many passers-by. I have felt the weight of sorrow, the burden of faith, the ache of doubt. But only once have I felt the world itself tilt toward one man. Only once did dust dance not from wind, but from joy. And I know he will return, because places remember. And I was the place where dust danced in his wake. They always ran. When the voices grew loud, when the crowds surged, when the temple guards approached, everyone ran. Feet scuffled on stone, sandals scraped against steps, bodies pressed through narrow gates. I had felt the tremor of panic many times before. The temple, for all its solemn beauty, was no stranger to fear. Protests, punishments, unexpected purgings, they all left traces. But that day, one man didn't run. He stood near the columns, not hiding, not frozen, just still, as if the chaos hadn't reached him, as if he'd chosen peace while the world screamed. I was close enough to feel the difference. Fear had a scent bitter, sharp, like metal in heat. But he didn't smell of fear. He smelled of rain, of olive branches, of open fields after fire. He watched the crowd, not with judgment or disdain, but sorrow, deep sorrow, not for himself, but for them. The others shouted. Some cried. A few laughed nervous, brittle laughter, the kind that always breaks when pushed. And still he stood. I knew then that the danger was for him, that the rage boiling through the courtyard was aimed his way. And yet he didn't flinch. He didn't brace. He received their fury like an altar receives sacrifice, not because it enjoys it, but because it's built to bear it. The guards reached him. 2, maybe 3. They didn't bark orders at first. They waited, unsure. Something about him held them back. I could feel it. They had faced rebels before, men who shouted or spat or begged. But this man met them with silence. Not resistance, not surrender, just presence. One guard stepped forward, unsure. His hand hovered near his weapon, but he didn't draw. The man spoke then, finally but softly. I didn't catch the words, but I felt their weight. Not a plea, not a protest, a truth. And still, he didn't run. He walked with them, not dragged, not shoved. He walked, willingly, as though he were leading them, not the other way around. The crowd parted slowly. Some looked away. Others stared, wide-eyed, mouths slightly open, as if trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told. A man accused, yet unafraid. A man condemned, yet calm. I remembered the wood from which I had been carved. Trees do not flee the axe. They stand until the blade finds them. There is something sacred in that stillness, something defiant in not fleeing, not because one is trapped, but because one is resolved. He carried that kind of stillness, the stillness of old roots and deeper truths. He passed me. Our eyes did not meet, looked ahead, but something in his gait acknowledged me. A slight turn of the head, a softening at the corner of his mouth. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition, as if he knew I had seen and remembered and would not forget. He left behind no object, no sign, only presence. And that presence echoed longer than any sound. Later, they beat him. I did not see it, but I heard the cries, the gasps, the sound of flesh against stone, wood against bone. And yet, even then, they said he did not resist. I imagined him there, silent not because he lacked words, but because no words were needed. He had already spoken by staying, by standing, by not running. And I, who had carried hundreds, who had borne the weight of kings and criminals, felt light that day, lighter than I should have, as though part of his strength had stayed with me, as though his stillness had soaked into my grain. I wanted to tell the others, the arches and stairs, the walls and gates, remember this, remember the man who didn't run. But I had no voice, only memory. Days passed, whispers grew. Some said he was dead. Others said the earth shook when he breathed his last. A veil tore, a tomb opened. None of this I saw, but I felt the change. Something loosened in the stone beneath me. The light in the temple changed not in brightness, but in clarity. The air held grief, but also something else, release. Like a long-held breath had finally been exhaled, and then he returned, not in flesh, not in sound, but in memory so vivid it became presence. Those who had fled began to come back, one by one. Some sat on me again, some wept, some said nothing, but all of them carried the same look, like people who had seen something too large to speak of. I held their weight gently. I remembered his stillness in their silence. A woman sat beside me one afternoon, hands folded, face turned toward the fading light. She didn't speak, but tears traced slow lines down her cheeks. I knew those tears. They were not for loss alone. They were for recognition, for the ache of having witnessed something holy and not knowing what to do with it. I did not move. I did not change shape, but I became something more. I was no longer just a bench. I was a place that remembered. That bore witness. That honored the stillness of a man who chose not to run. And I wait now not for another crowd or another cry, but for the return of that presence. The one who faced fury with mercy. The one who met accusation with silence. The one who stood when others fled. Because some stories are not told in words. They are told in how a man does not run. And I will always remember him. Even now, when footsteps echo through the courtyard, I listen differently. I watch for the walk that holds peace, for the presence that stills fear. And when I feel that familiar hush, that weightless gravity, I know he has passed by again. Not in flesh, perhaps, but in the hearts of those who carry his courage. The ones who do not run, the ones who stay. And in their staying, I remember him all over again. I was built to bear weight, to support those who needed rest. But that day, I bore something greater, not a body, but a moment, a revelation. And it marked me, not with scars, but with sacred memory. For when a man chooses not to flee, but to stand in truth, the place where he stands becomes holy. And I will forever be that place. And I will not forget. There was a day the sky refused to look. Clouds gathered low, heavy with grief. Even the sun, proud and faithful, dimmed its gaze. That was the day I remembered blood. Not the offerings brought by priests, not the lambs whose silence was ritual. This was different. This blood cried, not with sound, but with presence. It soaked into grain, into stone, into memory, and I would hewn long ago felt it deeper than fibers, deeper than time. I had known weight before, pilgrims leaning weary, children climbing without thought, elders resting between prayers. But that day, the weight changed. It did not come to sit. It came to be lifted, bound, raised, and I was chosen. Not because I was strong, but because I was there, because I could bear it. Hands gripped Mara, hurried, not cruel but resigned. I did not resist. How could I? But if I could have spoken, I would have asked, why him? Not in accusation, but ache. I had seen his face before, felt his passing presence, known his silence as sanctuary. And now that same silence wrapped itself around pain. He did not fight. He did not flee. He embraced Minot gently, but willingly. They laid him across me. The hammer rang. I have known many sound songs, prayers, laments, but never had I heard a sound like that. The metal pierced not only flesh, but the memory of all creation. With each strike, a truth shattered, and another was born. The weight that pressed upon me was not just his body, but all bodies, all burdens. And I held him. I, a beam once meant for shelter, became an instrument of death. But not just death. There was something else in the blood, something ancient, something eternal. As if Eden wept through his wounds, as if Sinai echoed in his silence, as if the whole story of Exodus, exile, and return was being retold in torn skin and splintered wood. And I remembered trees in a garden, one forbidden, one faithful. I remembered a staff that parted seas, a rod that budded with life. I remembered the ark, the temple, the altar. I remembered every place where wood had carried something holy. And now I carried him. He did not curse, he did not scream, he breathed. And even his breath bore blessing. The sky darkened, the wind stilled, the earth waited. And I bore him not because I was worthy, but because I was chosen. His blood ran along my frame, warm at first, then cooling. It did not stain it consecrated. It did not mark me for shame, but for memory. People came and went. Some spat, some wept, some watched in silence, their hearts torn between fear and longing. A mother stood nearby. Her tears fell like rain. I knew her face. I had known it since he was a child. She had once rested him on a bench not unlike me, and now she watched him die on my frame. And still, she did not look away. At some point, the ground shook, not from storm, but from sorrow. I felt it in my base, in the parts of me joined long ago by hands now dust. The earth groaned, the curtain tore, and no longer a tool of death, felt the shift. I had become something else. Not a beam, not a scaffold, a bridge. Between agony and redemption, between time and eternity. He spoke 7 times. I will never forget those words. They did not come from pain alone, but from purpose. Each syllable, a key. Each breath, a door. Forgiveness, belonging, abandonment, completion. They passed through me, entered the grain, lodged in the place where memory never dies. I do not speak, but I carry those words. I carry them for the world. When he breathed his last, it was not an end. It was a silence that rang louder than sound, a stillness that moved everything. His head bowed, his body sagged, and I held him, not just his weight, but his surrender. And in that surrender, I felt the world begin again. They took him down gently, the same hands that once fed him, bathed him, taught him to wallow, wrapped him in linen. I felt the separation. It was not violent, but it was deep. He had given everything, and I had received it. Not to keep, but to witness. They carried him away. I was left behind, alone, bloodied, silent, but not empty. No, never empty. I held something sacred now, something no fire could consume, no time could erode. I had become memory, testament. I had become the place where heaven touched horror and called it holy. The soldiers ignored me. They saw only a tool, a thing used and done. But I knew better. I had held the lamb. I had cradled the sun, and I would not forget. Days passed. Rain fell. The blood dried, but the presence did not fade. I stood under the gray sky, soaked not just with water, but with story. I felt the weight of silence again, but this time it hummed with promise. I did not know what would come, only that something had begun. And now, even splintered, even buried, I still remember. When people speak of him, I stir. When they whisper his name, my grain responds. For I am no longer just wood. I am witness. I am altar. I am cross. And I remember the day blood became mercy. I remember the moment the world stopped turning, not in fear but in awe. The moment the blood ran not in vain but into victory. I was there not chosen for beauty or strength, but chosen nonetheless. And because of him, I was made holy. Wood that held eternity. And I will remember, until the end of all things, the day love hung between heaven and earth and stayed. Long before he walked upon me, I knew his steps. Before sandals touched soil, before footprints marked time, I felt the pulse of his coming. For I am the earthwomb of creation, witness to fall, bearer of burden. I have cradled prophets, received blood, held bones, but never had I trembled until the day he stood upon me. He came not as a conqueror, not with armies or flags. He came as one who belonged. The soles of his feet met the ground with reverence, not domination, but union. Where others trampled, he walked. Where others tore, he healed. And every place his feet touched, I remembered Eden. I felt him before I saw him. His weight was different, not heavier, but fuller. Like each step carried both heaven and history. His presence did not press it settled, as though he trusted me, as though I, broken and bruised by centuries of pain, could still bear the promise of redemption. He knelt once, near a garden, his fingers pressed into my dust, drew lines I could not read, but I understood. He was not just drawing, he was remembering, shaping, as he once shaped Adam. From me, he was not above me, he was one with me. I bore the weight of his laughter, light and free. I bore the press of his knees in Gethsemane. I felt the tremor of his anguish, the slow crush of his surrender, and I held it all. I did not break, I could not, for I was made to hold him. Even as others mocked, as soldiers dragged him, as blood fell I caught it. I caught it not in pride, but in ache. To receive the blood of the one who had formed me was more than sacred, it was fulfillment. When he fell, I caught his face. When he wept, I drank his tears. I held him not with hands, but with the whole of my being, and when they raised the cross, I did not fight. I opened myself to its base. I let it stand, not because I approved, but because I knew this was the way. The seed must fall to the ground. The body must rest in the dust. The grave must open, not to consume but to give back. I had opened for many graves, kings, prophets, thieves, but never like this. His tomb was not a defeat, it was a planting, a burial that hummed with becoming. I held his body, wrapped in linen, fragrant with oil, still and sacred. The stone rolled shut, but I knew it would not last. My silence held breath, not absence. In the darkness of those days, I did not sleep. I remembered every step he had taken, every footprint he had left, from Bethlehem to Nazareth, from desert to sea, from temple to hill. He had walked the full length of human sorrow, and now, in death, he rested in me, and I waited. Then morning, not just sunrise, resurrection. The stone moved, the air changed, light touched me in a way it had not since the beginning, and he rose not in spirit only, but in flesh, glorified, yes, but still bearing the marks. His feet touched me again, scarred, radiant, alive, and I knew joy, deep, groaning joy, the kind only the earth can know after ages of death. He walked again. For 40 days, he left traces, conversations, healings, meals shared, and every step, every place he stood, became sacred, not because of monument or memory, but because of presence. Then he ascended, his feet lifted. For the first time, I felt the loss of him, not a loss of sorrow, but a holy ache, the absence that speaks of return. I carry that ache still, in every hill, every valley, every patch of soil where hope has been planted. I remember his feet. I remember their dust, their weight, their warmth. I remember when the Creator let creation hold him, and I wait now not for footsteps, but for the tremble of glory, for the return of the one who once walked upon Menot as stranger, but as son. Sometimes I hear his name whispered by winds. Sometimes his story echoes in the footsteps of those who follow him. I feel the weight of martyrs, the prayers of the poor, the journeys of pilgrims, all pressing into me with longing, with faith, with pain. They walk where he walked, they fall where he fell, they rise where he rose. I am not just soil, I am story. I held the first man, I hold the memory of the second, and I await the last day when all graves open, when all tears are dried, when his feet touch me once more. Not in suffering, not in flight, but in rain. He will come, and this time, the earth will not tremble in sorrow, but in welcome. For I remember him. I remember his weight, his steps, his silence. I remember the holy pause before resurrection, and I know my waiting is not in vain. He will come, and every stone, every tree, every grain of dust will know him, as I once did, as I still do, and the earth beneath his feet will sing, and I will rise too, not in movement, but in meaning. For what I held once, I hold forever, not in form, but in memory. The weight of him sanctified me. His story made me more than dust. I am promise. I am ground that once bore God, and I will not forget. I felt his final step before he ascended. Gentle, certain, it pressed into me with love, not weight. That print has never left. It's there unseen by eyes, but known by spirit. Every time a soul turns toward him, that footprint deepens. Every time grace is given, the soil rejoices. For I am the earth. I remember him. And one day, when he comes again, I will lift mountains to meet him. I was not meant to move. I was chosen precisely because I could not. Heavy, fixed, final, that was my nature. I was the seal of endings, the last word after burial, the unspoken command to forget and move on. For generations, I had closed the mouths of tombs, and so, when they rolled me before his grave, I obeyed. I became silence. But he was not like the others. From the moment they laid him inside, the air changed. The darkness did not feel empty, it felt full, as though the tomb was not consuming, but gestating. The stillness was not decay, but pause. And I, the stone, keeper of silence, began to tremble. I remembered the press of his body as they carried him past me. I remembered the weight of their grief, heavy on every shoulder. I remembered the whisper of linen against rock, the slow retreat of feet, the final grinding of my movement as they sealed the tomb. Then the waiting. Night fell, then another, then another. The world outside had moved on, but not me. I remained. I listened. I watched. If you had eyes, you would have seen nothing. But I saw, not with sight, but with certainty. Something was shifting, not in time, but in eternity. The pulse of creation began to beat beneath me, not louder, but deeper, as if the one within was remembering who he was. Then came the light. It did not break in like a torch or rise like the sun. It bloomed, from within, from behind me. I was still sealed, still fixed, but the tomb was no longer a grave. It was a womb. And the man inside was no longer still. He stood, he breathed, he moved. And I moved too, not by command, not by force. I moved in awe. I, the unmoving, moved. Not to release him, he had already risen, but to testify, to witness, to respond. I had spent centuries saying nothing. Now I spoke the only way I could. I rolled away. The women came early, before dawn, voices low, hands trembling. I recognized them, not their names, but their hearts. They had wept beside me. Their tears had touched my base. Now they came to anoint, to mourn, to complete what death had left unfinished. But I was no longer silence. I was proclamation. They saw me, and they knew. I had moved. The tomb was open. The body was gone. One stepped forward, hesitant. Another gasped. One dropped her jar, unthinking. And I said nothing, for I had no voice. But the angel did. Clothed in light, seated beside where he had lain, he spoke the truth I had cradled for 3 days. He is not here. He is risen. And oh, how the earth responded. Their feet flew, their cries rang out, their silence broke into praise. And I, though unmoving now, still echoed with the power of that morning. I, who once sealed death, had become the threshold of life. The soldiers who had guarded me fled. They had felt the quake. They had seen the light. But they did not understand. To them, I was a threat, a breach, a question. But to the women, to the disciples who would soon come running, I was answer. I was joy. I was the exhale of heaven after holding its breath. Time passed. Pilgrims came. Some touched me. Some wept. Some doubted. Some sang. But all who approached did so with the knowledge that something impossible had happened. Not magic, not myth, resurrection. And though I am stone, I am not cold. I remember. I remember the weight of him, the stillness, the light, the breath. I remember the moment history cracked open, and I remember that I moved. The world tries to seal things, tombs, hearts, hopes. But I testify, the one they tried to bury rose, and nothing has been the same. Sometimes I wonder why I, of all stones, was chosen. I had no beauty, no inscription, no history. I was just heavy, silent, ordinary. But maybe that is why. So that when I moved, no one could doubt it. So that when the impossible happened, there would be no confusion, only awe. He could have risen in secret, could have vanished and appeared elsewhere. But instead, he let the stone speak. He let the world see. He wanted witnesses, not just people but creation itself, the ground, the air, the stone. I have been still ever since. I have not moved again. I do not need to. That one movement changed everything. It broke the pattern. It split the silence. It opened the story. Now, when people come, I feel their longing, their doubt, their desperation. They run fingers along my surface, hoping to touch what I once held. And though I am empty, I am not hollow. I am full of the moment when death lost, when love won, when eternity opened its mouth and sang. And I will not forget, even if I am shattered, even if I am buried, Even if time wears me down to dust, I will remember. For I am the stone that once sealed him in, and I am the stone that moved to let him out. I am the stone that spoke back. And every morning since, when the sun rises and light rolls over the hills, I remember the first light that rose from within me. I remember the soundless glory, the sacred silence breaking. I remember not just a resurrection, but a return. The world was never the same, and creation have never stopped echoing his name. He is risen. He is risen indeed, and I, once silent stone, will carry that truth until all things are made new.